that enough?
That's plenty.
Okay. But yeah, I can do a detailed intro if you all want, but
we don't
I think
need
we're
the
good.
details.
I do want to just say one thing, though, that from my perspective, for our focus here on getting restoration done and doing it right, both themes John is very good at emphasizing and reminding us all the time. Us scientists who always want to focus on the doing it right with the science, John's very good at saying, but we also have to get it done.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure how I can live up to these comments. I suppose one thing I might say to begin with is I'm not sure that the title of this session is correct. I think getting it done but doing it right is perhaps a better way to emphasize it, because I think there's a lot of habitat restoration that is being done, can be done, is planned to be done, but if it's not done right, it will be a drain on resources and in the long run be ineffective in reaching the goals that we want. So it's a subtle change of wording, but I think it's something important to bear in mind, that it's really critical to get it right as we do it. So what I would like to do today, I think I have a PowerPoint coming up here somewhere. There we go. What I would like to do today is summarize for you the report of the Delta Independent Science Board coming from our review of programs and projects having to do with habitat restoration in the Delta. And the background for this, of course, comes from the Delta Reform Act, which charged the Independent Science Board with conducting reviews of science programs and in support of adaptive management and monitoring, and conveying the results of those reviews to the Stewardship Council. So in a sense, that's what I'm doing. We took a rather different approach to this, however. Instead of reviewing individual programs and individual elements within agencies, we decided at the outset to review thematic areas, and there are two reasons for doing that. One is that there are a huge number of programs bringing science to bear on issues in the Delta. To review each one individually every 4 years would be a massive effort, and I think more importantly, would not give us the kind of results we wanted. We would end up with perhaps detailed assessments of individual programs that had no particular cohesion among those reviews. And it seemed to us that that would fragment the assessments and would fail to recognize that there are a number of programs that are essentially addressing the same kinds of issues, and that the future of science in the Delta requires bringing those together to have a consolidated approach to what is going on in the Delta. So you can tell me later on whether you think this is an appropriate way to approach it, or whether we ought to go back to the letter of the statute and review individual programs individually and separately from one another. We chose to look at habitat restoration as the first of these thematic areas because it's central to the goal of restoring the ecological integrity of the Delta, and it is also one of the chief means of mitigating the effects of any kind of actions to provide more reliable water supplies to California. I might mention that our second review is now beginning, and that is going to deal with what we've labeled fish and flows, which is looking really at the problem of flows into and through the Delta, and in particular how they are influencing fish resources of various sorts. So that'll be coming at some point. And if you should decide that our thematic approach to reviewing programs is in some way not appropriate, then it would be good to know that before we go too far on fish and flows. So what did we ask when we were doing this? We asked what is being done, what is being planned in the way of habitat restoration in the Delta, how is science being used in all of this, and in particular, how is this looking toward the future? How are the potential effects of climate change, other environmental changes being incorporated into habitat restoration planning and implementation? And we did this by conducting interviews, discussions with various agencies, water districts, consultants, NGOs, universities, and attending the presentations at the Bay Delta Science Conference to basically gather information. We reviewed a variety of documents, and we brought our own individual experiences with habitat restoration and with similar kinds of problems into play. And on the basis of this, we've conducted this review, and I think you have seen or should see the report that comes out of this, which contains all the gory details behind what I will summarize today. The first things I would point out is there's a huge amount of skill and enthusiasm that is being used already in habitat restoration in the Delta. There's a lot of habitat restoration going on. The people that are involved in this are totally dedicated to it. They are very knowledgeable in it. They are enthusiastic about it. There's a lot there to be built upon. And there is a lot of good habitat restoration that is being done. We're not starting from a blank slate. One of the things that we asked early on is what habitat restoration is being done. And it turned out to be a more difficult task than we had envisioned. The map here is a result of some efforts by the Delta Science Program in collaboration with Delta Conservancy and DWR to identify those areas in which habitat restoration is currently underway, has been done, or is being planned. This information is not readily available. This map is one of the outcomes of our review, and it struck us as rather odd that there would be all this habitat restoration going on, and there was not a unified source of information to tell you what was being done where, by whom. And hopefully this will provide a foundation for keeping this updated as we go forward. You'll see already that some of these areas are located in the priority areas that are identified as part of the Delta Plan. Some of them are not, and some of those priority areas do not have currently identified or underway habitat restoration efforts. So this is a template, in a sense, for where we are now and where we might be headed with habitat restoration. In the report, we summarized our findings with reference to 9 criteria of an ideal habitat restoration project. These were developed from various sources, predominantly from the Society for Ecological Restoration, which has, over the years, put a considerable amount of effort into providing guidance for habitat restoration in a broad sense. It should not be lost on you that we have 9 steps in this, and there are 9 steps in the adaptive management cycle that is part of the Delta Plan. There seems to be something magic about the number 9, and we'll have to see if that bears fruit in the future. The first requirement really is have clear goals. You can't get somewhere if you don't know where you're going. And it is true that many of the projects that we heard about had some idea of what their goals were, what they wanted to achieve in habitat restoration. But the goals were different among the projects, which is perhaps not too surprising. But the problem that we identified is that if we're going to think about habitat restoration as being something that is going to contribute to the overall ecological integrity and restoration of the Delta ecosystems as a whole, there needs to be integration among those projects, and there needs to be some kind of common set of goals or sharing of goals, at least a sense that people know what one another's goals really are in doing this, rather than simply framing goals, some of which are framed from regulatory requirements, some of which are single species oriented, some of which are oriented toward ecosystem processes, some of which are rather fuzzy and unclear. So there needs to be more thought given, in a sense, to what the goals are, and that goes along then with the notion of performance measures, that you can't really develop the performance measures for restoration projects if you haven't clearly articulated what your goals are to begin with. This is common sense, it seems to me, but it's not something that falls out automatically of planning a restoration project. I might point out also that in the Delta plan, there's a distinction made between operational performance goals and outcome performance goals. And in our thinking, we tended to focus on the outcome performance goals. That's the ultimate measure of how well a restoration project is going. The number of acres restored gives you an approximate measure of, are you doing what you said you were going to do? The outcome performance measures are telling you whether it did any good or not. And that's the acid test, really, of it. A second requirement is that the spatial context of projects be taken into consideration. We recognize certainly the reality that where one does restoration is going to be constrained by the availability of sites, permitting, funding, a variety of constraining factors on where you can do restoration. The problem, however, is that this frequently ends up with one-off kinds of habitat restoration projects, where each is done independently of what is being done elsewhere, without considering either the surrounding landscape of that restoration project or what restoration or other activities are being done elsewhere. A restoration project conducted upstream is going to affect what happens in a restoration project done downstream. And to consider those as independent of one another is missing the integration between them. A third criterion is that you need to take time into consideration. I think everyone now recognizes that the Delta is a very dynamic place. It changes on any kind of time scale that one might want to consider. This is going to be more so in the future as the effects of climate change and other environmental changes, land use change, so on, play out. Most of the people that we talked to were aware of the reality of climate change, factored it into their thinking, almost always in the context of sea level rise. And that's appropriate, but there are other elements of climate change that are also important: temperature changes, changes in the frequency of extreme events, and so on. And a lot of these changes are going to be nonlinear changes. They are going to be threshold changes. And anticipating thresholds is an area of considerable discussion in academic ecology these days, and science in general. People don't know how to tell thresholds until you're past them, generally. But it's important that they be done, and it's important that we not think of habitat restoration projects as proceeding merrily along a trajectory that is uniform and linear over time. Adaptive management is repeated so often that it elicits almost a ho-hum kind of a response. It's mandated by the Delta Reform Act. Everyone that we talked with talked about adaptive management. No one provided specifics about how adaptive management was going to be done. And when we probed them, it was obvious that there were different perceptions about how adaptive management should be done. Everyone viewed it as a circle of some sort, but the components of that circle, whether it involved 4 steps or 8 steps or 9 or 16 steps, differed, and the importance of different components varied. I think that the Delta Plan has outlined a very thorough and workable approach to thinking about adaptive management, and that ought to be the template for thinking about adaptive management as we go forward. I can't help at this point, however, put in an aside, and this is something that is a personal aside shared by members of the Science Board, but not part of our report. And that is that adaptive management, despite what the statute says, is not a panacea for everything. Adaptive management is not appropriate in some situations. And this diagram, which is taken from a Department of Interior set of guidelines on adaptive management, simply puts it in the position of axes of the degree to which one has control over the elements of a system on the bottom, and the degree to which there is uncertainty in the outcomes of things. And where you have a high degree of control, and there is at the same time a high degree of uncertainty about what might happen, that's when you use adaptive management. And I think that's when it has been thought about. But there are situations in which you have very low control over what goes on in a system, and therefore, almost by definition, you have limited capacity to adapt your management actions to what goes on. I think this is simply a caution to think carefully about when and where and whether adaptive management is really going to be appropriate in particular circumstances, rather than assuming that it always must be done and it must be done in a particular way. A fifth component of doing good habitat restoration is putting in place the monitoring program. You can't conduct adaptive management without monitoring. And even if you don't do adaptive management, you have no way of gauging whether you are getting anywhere closer to your goals if you don't monitor what is going on in the system. But monitoring can mean a wide variety of things. My background is with birds, and to me monitoring involves going out on a nice spring day and counting birds to see what's there, and doing that spring after spring, and it tells you something in the long run. But what it tells you may be irrelevant to the goals you have in mind. So there needs to be some real consideration given to what to monitor, when to monitor, how often, how long. Monitoring is something that really requires very careful situation-specific design that is related to the goals of the project. And in order to conduct monitoring and use it for anything, you also need to have a very good data management system in place. Monitoring generates data. The data are useless unless they are put into some kind of data management framework where they can be synthesized and made quickly available to the people who need the data and the information. So monitoring by itself is necessary but not sufficient to meet the goals of habitat restoration. And what that means, of course, is that monitoring requires a long-term commitment to do it. You don't just go out and monitor 2 years after a habitat restoration and assume that you're finished. And it requires the funding to do that. And at the present time, neither the long-term commitment nor the funding exist for many of the projects that we heard about or are being planned. Modeling is a key component of all of this. Modeling figures importantly in adaptive management, and it's specified in the Delta Plan in terms of where it fits into this. Modeling can be a very powerful tool, particularly used in developing various scenarios and asking what-if questions as a means of essentially conducting mind experiments on the system without actually going out and doing pilot studies. And modeling at the same time can be very involved, very sophisticated, and very expensive. And we heard examples of such models that are really elegant models in terms of the science that is involved. They are inaccessible models to many of the people who are charged with actually doing the planning and the implementation of habitat restoration. So there needs to be some way to dovetail the sophisticated, complex, expensive modeling efforts with simpler approaches, so that one, in a sense, can validate the simpler approaches by pairing them against the projections of the more complex models. You don't need a complex model to address every question in habitat restoration or every question about what is going on in the Delta. The models need to be tuned to the goals and the questions that are important. I think in many respects, this is one of our major findings, and you heard it time and time again with reference to other things. You heard it earlier today with reference to drought and water conditions. And that is the need for coordination of planning and implementation. We heard examples of people from different agencies who talk to one another and try to coordinate. But the reality is that restoration efforts in the Delta are not coordinated. They tend to go on independently, and they are not coordinated with other non-restoration management actions. If something is being done, for example, upstream on levee maintenance or levee breakage, that is going to influence the efficiency and effectiveness of a habitat restoration that is being done downstream. You can't do these things independently of one another and expect them to work. It requires overall coordination of these. And if you don't have that kind of broad coordination, it's not possible to then begin to think about how to prioritize efforts. And the reality, of course, is that you can't do everything in the Delta, and therefore there needs to be thinking about what to do first, what to do where. And that requires that you have coordination, that you don't have everyone running off and doing their own things simply to get X number of acres restored. All of this requires science, and science requires scientific expertise. As I indicated at the outset, there's a lot of enthusiasm about this, there's a lot of dedication to it, but the people who we talk to doing the science are stretched very thin. And if the magnitude of habitat restoration that is anticipated in the various plans is going to be done, and is going to be done based on science, it is going to require more scientific expertise behind it. Some of that expertise can be found in consultants. There's a considerable amount of scientific expertise that is already being used to conduct habitat restoration from consultants. Some is available in NGOs. Some is available in universities. A lot is available in agencies. It needs to be coordinated and it needs to be beefed up. And this, of course, is what you would expect to hear from an independent science board. But it is also a reality. Science and adaptive management, none of this is going to happen unless there is the person power there to support it. And finally, the ninth element of doing successful adaptive management involves the rest of the people out there, getting the stakeholders involved early and often. And communication, we found, with stakeholders, at least the key stakeholders for individual habitat restoration projects, is generally good. People do a good job of communicating with the stakeholders that seem to be most directly involved in habitat restoration projects. But that needs to occur throughout the process, from the very beginning on through the end. That's how you get the stakeholders on board in terms of this. And the more you need integration and the more you require integration among projects, the more difficult it begins to be to coordinate the stakeholders, because now you must pull together stakeholders over a broader region from a variety of interest areas. But in the long run, that's a key to success and successful buy-in for the restorations. So those are the key findings. There are other findings that are in our report, and you can read those as good bedtime reading if you want. We ended up with 4 major areas of recommendation, and the first of these follows from what I've just been saying and emphasizes coordination. That we felt very strongly that if things are going to be done successfully for habitat restoration in the Delta, to meet the co-equal goals, to mitigate the effects of any actions for enhancing water availability, there has to be better coordination. The coordination is not just necessary for people to talk together, but that enables you to recognize the synergies, the fact that if you network restoration projects together, that you're getting something much greater than the sum of the individual parts. You're moving toward treating the Delta as an overall ecosystem rather than a place for a bunch of individual projects. Uncertainty is something that is mentioned frequently in the Delta Plan, in discussions about the Delta, and the only thing that is certain is that the future is going to be more uncertain than the past has been. And that uncertainty needs to be factored into the planning and implementation of restoration projects. Every restoration project that I've seen has goals and expectations that if you do this, you'll proceed in an orderly fashion toward meeting that goal. Things will play out exactly as you have planned them. This is sort of the occupational design of anybody involved in planning. But things don't work out that way. The future is likely to be full of surprises and things that don't turn out as they were expected to be. So there needs to be flexibility. And this is where adaptive management comes into play. This is where modeling comes into play. But for adaptive management to be useful in this regard, it needs to be nimble and flexible and fast. And if you think about that 9-step process of adaptive management that's outlined in the Delta Plan, you realize that every one of those steps takes time. And getting from one step to another step to another step makes it, in the long run, a very ponderous process. There needs to be ways to speed up adaptive management and make it more responsive to changing uncertainties. And this, I think, is a fertile area for thinking about and developing new approaches. Our third recommendation is that there needs to be a prioritization of restoration projects. This is part of coordinating among projects, but thinking of projects as a network of interrelated parts in which you look at each of them in terms not just of what is accomplished by that individual restoration project, but by that project in relationship to other projects. And you then prioritize them in terms of not just what they contribute in terms of an acreage goal, but what they contribute in terms of reaching those outcome performance measures of enhancing the health of the Delta ecosystem. And finally, going back to what I said before, strengthening science expertise, strengthening information management, strengthening communication, so that all of this can in fact happen, creating the infrastructure, if you will, that achieves the integration and the coordination of habitat restoration. And I would mention here a fifth recommendation that is not part of our, formally part of our report, but was a thread that ran through it all, that all of this is not just going to happen. It requires commitment, and in particular requires funding and long-term funding. And if there's not thought given to how to create reliable, long-term, consistent support for habitat restoration, then we're likely to get into a situation where a lot of projects start off and then they falter. The adaptive management isn't completed, the monitoring isn't completed, we don't really see how well things are doing, or critical elements of a restoration project are not completed. And if that's the case, then that might as well not have been done. It's a piecemeal effort that falls short of what we really need. So with that, I'll conclude by simply using a metaphor that I've used before of the Delta as a labyrinth. And it's certainly a physical labyrinth, but it's also a labyrinth of people and projects and priorities and agendas. And I think that this simply illustrates the challenge that all of us face of trying to navigate through this labyrinth of interests and people and programs and priorities. And it affects habitat restoration. It affects everything that is done. So I think with that, thank you for your attention. And at some point, I'd be happy to try to deflect your questions.
Okay. Dawn, did you have